Chapter 4. Escapes and Escapades. There was a peculiar rhythmic rumbling sound beneath me, and a squeaking and creaking all around. Something soft but dusty was pressed against my face, and I had a terrible headache. I seemed to be inside some sort of box, but it could not have been made of a solid material, because I could see light through cracks on the side. As my head cleared, my desire for movement grew, and as I realized how handicapped I was, so my sense of panic increased. I started to cry out for help, and almost immediately Ernesto's voice said from somewhere above, "You're all right, chicken. We're with you. This is Ernesto." The sound of his voice was very reassuring, but I thought that I also detected a note of real fear, and it was this that made me close my eyes and try not to think of where I was nor what was happening. The drumming sound underneath and the creaking all around me seemed interminable, until at last I heard a whispered voice say, "I think we'll be all right now. Let's get her out." I agreed with the voice wholeheartedly. This was not the way I had planned my meeting with Il Duce. I heard the sound of buckles being undone about my head, and then the sound of rods being drawn through metal rings. Something heavy and enveloping was lifted from on top of me, and the blast of cold, fresh air hit me. I sat up and found that I had been unceremoniously packed into a theatrical skip, a type of large wicker laundry basket. My head was still rather whirly, but even that did not explain the swaying motion of the walls all around or the drumming noise underneath. There was only a dim light, but I saw that Ernesto and Massimo were on either side of the skip offering to help me out. I took their arms and stood up unsteadily. The moment I was up, terrible pins and needles started in my legs, and I felt even dizzier than I had when I was lying down. However, they sat me down on the box and put my head between my knees, and after a few minutes I began to feel better. "Where on earth are we?" I asked. "We're on a train," Ernesto explained, adding rather sheepishly, "in the luggage van." "Whatever is going on, Ernesto?" I shouted, but he put his hand over my mouth and told me I must be quiet. "The guard thinks you are a dangerous snake. That's why we are allowed to travel in here with the skip, so you must stay quiet. Otherwise he will find out, and we'll all be for the chop." I think he chose that rather quaint phrase to try and emphasize his point, although neither he nor I really understood what it meant. "Italia is too danger," Massimo tried to explain. "Signor Bonarovoci is saving you to France. For me, journey is too danger," he said, looking nervously round the boxes and suitcases that were our travelling companions. I still did not understand what was going on, and Ernesto, seeing the look on my face, knelt down beside me and explained in whispers that it had been planned to arrest me after the recital. Mussolini wanted to see me in person, but after that, I was to be detained for the duration of the war. Realizing the danger, but realizing too that the only chance of escape was to kidnap me at the country house, where my disappearance would be least expected, he had arranged that Massimo, disguised as a chauffeur, should arrive at the house as if to take us away, and then drive Ernesto and the skip to catch the night train to Milan. "We will soon be safe enough," Ernesto said finally. "We are leaving the train to Piacenza in disguise, and the skip will travel on to Milan undisturbed, because the guard has been told not to come in, or else the snake might be angered. We have friends who will take care of the rest. Now, the best thing you can do is lie down and try to sleep a little. It's going to be a long night." I was not at all happy about all the cloak and dagger business, and I certainly felt very peeved about the undignified way that I'd been taken away from Mussolini. I'd been rather looking forward to saying to my friends that I had once drunk a glass of champagne with him. However, as there was nothing I could do, I dozed fitfully until Ernesto gave me a gentle shake and said, "It's time to get ready, chicken." He and Massimo had changed out of their smart clothes into workman's overalls and old jackets, and gave me what appeared to be early Elizabethan knee breeches with stockings and cross garters to put on. Well, I felt like Malvolio. There was a sort of jerkin that I put over a coarse cloth shirt and a large floppy hat made from brown felt. It was not a very flattering costume, but under the circumstances, I was in no position to complain. The train was beginning to slow down as I finished tying the laces on my heavy shoes. "We're just pulling into the siding," said Ernesto. "The van should be in the road just on the other side of the wall, marked Martini. Don't open the door again until the train has stopped." "There's the wall," said Massimo, after we jumped down from the train. It lay about 30 yards away across some tracks and over a piece of waste ground. At the front of the train we could hear a ringing sound that gradually grew louder as it approached us. "Wheel tapper," whispered Ernesto, pushing me forward. I did not know what he meant. It seemed a strange time to start new dance steps, but I saw Massimo running across the tracks with his body bent low, and assumed I was supposed to follow him. Running across strange railway tracks dressed as a 16th century peasant in the cold light of early dawn was certainly a novel experience, and I like to think that I entered into the spirit of the occasion. I tried to remember all I had read in The Count of Monte Cristo and The Prisoner of Zenda about escaping from captivity, and even though my setting was less attractive, I think I succeeded in cultivating the image of a desperado as I scaled the brick wall and fell into Massimo's arms on the other side. To our great relief, we saw a small furniture van parked about 100 yards away from us, and we rammed to it and climbed inside. The doors were slammed, the engine of the van started up, and we lurched off on the next leg of our journey. In the van was a basket containing a bottle of wine and some food. The wine was very different from what I was accustomed to drinking. If Cook had produced it at the Towers, Father would have been horrified. Perhaps that was why we hardly ever drank Italian wine at home. The bread was good, though, and after a couple of tomatoes and an apple, I began to feel better. The furniture van was only slightly more comfortable than the train. There were folded sheets and old blankets that we sat on, and there was not the awful drumming sounds from the rails underneath. The noise was still too loud to permit conversation without shouting, though, and Ernesto and Massimo, who must have been awake all night, gradually nodded off to sleep. Following one brief stop to stretch our legs, we drove on for another 3 hours, taking quite a risk as we drove through the centre of Turin before climbing up into the mountains. After one piece of loud revving and violent gear-changing, we started to move slowly over very bumpy ground. We were bounced around in the back like potatoes in an automatic peeler, but still the van laboured on for another 10 minutes, until it finally shuddered to a halt and the engine was switched off. The van had stopped at the end of a rough track that led up a narrow valley between two towering rocky sides. Above these in the distance stood even higher mountains, and the highest of all still had a covering of snow on the summits, even in midsummer. The driver introduced himself as Pierre. He was French, and as I later discovered, was working for the resistance. He seemed edgy like the rest of us, but when he found out I could at least speak French, he relaxed a little. "Well, monsieur," he said to Ernesto, "I think we can get her into France without too much trouble, but it's going to mean a lot of walking. Is mademoiselle up to it?" "You need have no worry about that," Ernesto replied confidently. "This young lady has many hidden talents. I have always had every confidence in her." There was something in the way he answered Pierre that suddenly made me realize he was not coming with me. I had assumed from the moment when he told me about our escape on the train that we would be escaping together. I certainly had not realized that this moment was to be the last time I was ever to see Ernesto. Pierre said it was too dangerous to stay too long, and Ernesto led me aside to say goodbye. He handed me something which I still have to this day: the straw hat with the blue ribbon. He had brought this all the way from Vicenza as a souvenir of the day by the lake and all the wonderful times that we had spent together. He told me to put the hat on, and then he threw his arms round me and held me very close and tight. "You're going to be quite safe," he whispered. "Pierre will look after you. Now, be a good girl, and remember everything that I have taught you." Oh, Ernesto, at that moment how I needed all you taught me about breath control in order to keep my emotions hidden. You will need those lessons now more than you have ever done. Arrivederci, little chicken, and God bless you. Then he gave me a final hug and turned away. Pierre, who was now quite a long way up the track, turned round and beckoned me to follow him quickly. I put my best foot forward and started up the track after him, and as I trudged up, I heard through my sobs the sound of Ernesto's voice, softly singing the last bars of Mimi's farewell. I could not join in with him now. My voice was not there. I never had the chance to sing with him again. We spent the whole of that day climbing up one track after the other. In the afternoon the heat became almost intolerable, but mercifully Pierre had a water bottle with him, from which we took sips when our thirst became too much to bear. The only food that he brought with him was 4 apples and a carrot. "Now you should toss up between the apples or the carrot," he said, as we stopped for a break under a rocky ledge in the late afternoon sun. "I'll have the carrot," I said, looking at the size of the 2 apples he was offering. Well, it tasted better than any vegetable I'd ever eaten. It was even better than the prize carrots that Pepper grew for the Bracket Basing Horticultural and Market Garden Society annual fetes. Annette was saying something. It was just beginning to get dark when we came to a little shepherd's hut where we were going to spend the night. The shepherd reminded me of Pepper with his cooking pot hanging over the fire, and for the first and only time in my life, I achieved my dream of eating a meal from a pot like that. The smell in the pot was dreadful, but I was so hungry that I think I would have eaten anything. After the meal, the shepherd very kindly let me share his bed with whatever little creatures caused him to keep scratching himself, while he and Pierre slept on the beaten earth floor on top of sheepskins. It was still dark when I was woken up, and after eating some tasteless but warming porridge cooked by the shepherd, we left the hut. We walked briskly for a couple of hours, by which time Pierre said we were very near the frontier. His pace slowed, and he began moving cautiously from rock to rock, listening for sounds of guards on either side of the border. I became very frightened for the first time since I'd woken up in the train. I tried to think of Ernesto, and I tried to hear his voice saying, "You are a dramatic actress. You are an opera singer. Call on your acting," and that is exactly what I did. Whenever I was faced in future years with difficult roles, I used to remember my feelings that morning, crossing into France, and it's always helped. As soon as the path we had been following started to go down, though, I knew that we were safe, well, at least for the time being. Late in the afternoon, we reached a high alpine pasture and a type of chalet, very like the ones I'd seen in Switzerland. Now this was Pierre's home, where I was going to rest for a few days. I longed for a wash, and when I looked in the little mirror hanging about the cracked but spotless marble washstand, I was horrified by my appearance. My hair was matted and straggly, my face was streaked with dirt, and the clothes I was wearing were in a dreadful state. I must have looked very strange to them when I appeared, but none of them said anything, and they never asked any questions. I never found out their surname, but it was safer that way, just in case anything went wrong. I stayed with them for only 3 days, though in some respects they were the longest 3 days of my life. I had to wait while Pierre contacted the local resistance group to arrange for false identity papers and travel documents. Now, luckily, I always carried my Italian identity card with me, and they were able to use the photograph from this on forged French papers. On the evening of my second day, a man came to the house to see me. His name was Marcel, and he was the coordinator of the local resistance group. All I really remember about him was his long raincoat that reached down well below his calves, and the enamel badge on his collar with a monogram that I could not work out. After talking with Pierre and me, Marcel decided that the best method of escape would be to get me to Paris, where there was a far greater likelihood of being able to escape from France. It was decided I should travel under the identity of a waitress in search of a job in Paris. So they spent the following day preparing my papers and arranging for my various alibis. Late in the evening of the third day, Marcel reappeared with a simple dress and overcoat, a suitcase, and my papers. He'd given me the name of Florence Blum. I was 22, single, and orphaned. I had lived with my aunt, Gabrielle Blum, in the little town of Moudon, where I was to catch the train, until her death 2 months ago. I had a contact in Paris through whom I hoped to find a job working in the restaurants and cafes that were now doing a roaring trade following the German occupation. I thought that Florence sounded rather dull, but I was not really in a position to argue over the casting in this particular instance. However, I looked upon it as a challenge, and it was certainly quite a plot. I don't think even dear Agatha Christie could have set this one up, brilliant writer though she was. The walk down to Moudon took an hour, and we arrived at the station at about 6:30 in the morning. There was already quite a crowd at the ticket window, though most of them were only travelling as far as Chambray. There were a few travelling to Lyon, but I was the only one buying a ticket for Paris. "Well, if you're going to do the thing properly, you better start now. Go and buy your ticket and don't worry. I'll be here to keep an eye on you," Marcel said gruffly. So, with my fingers twitching my purse and my heart in my mouth, I walked up to the window and asked for a ticket to Paris. "Single or return?" asked the man on the other side. Single, please," I stammered, and fumbled in my purse for the fare. However, there were people behind pushing to get to the window, and I was able to collect my tickets and go back to Marcel without anyone realizing how nervous I was. "Very good," said Marcel coldly. "Now let's see if you can get on the train." I don't think that I could ever make a friend of Marcel. He knew what he was doing, and he knew what he had to do, but he never did or said anything with a smile. I suppose looking back, he was probably as terrified as us all. The carriage I climbed into was full of farmers and their wives. There was one big fat woman opposite me, bursting out of her coat and struggling to hold 3 chickens in a string bag on her lap. The chickens had their wings tied together, but they were still able to flap their wings and make a terrible row. There were feathers everywhere, and one of them had even laid an egg. I don't know how she managed to do it on the train. After Chambray, where many of the farming folk got out, the train stopped at Dijon, and we were all made to show our identity papers to German officers standing on the platform. As the line of people in which I was standing gradually moved forward, I looked at the German officer who would deal with me. "Oh, what's he going to say?" I asked myself, feeling very nervous and insecure. Just before my turn came, I thought of Ernesto saying, "Remember, you are an actress." "Where are you travelling?" asked the German, in guttural French. "Oh, to Paris," I answered, perhaps slightly louder than was really necessary. I explained why I was travelling to Paris, and he looked at my suitcase and said, "You have your waitress uniform in there, I suppose?" he inquired. "Oh, no," I replied with a sudden flash of inspiration. "They're going to supply that when I start work." "Are you expecting fine weather?" he asked, giving my straw hat a wry look. I hoped and prayed that he would not look inside it and see the label of the shop in Vicenza where Ernesto had brought it. Why, naturally, I expect fine weather wherever I go, I answered, smiling broadly, and putting the hat on my head with a flamboyant sweep. After this inspection, we climbed back onto the train and set off again to Paris. My state of tension and anxiety was not made any easier by the woman sitting next to me, who spent the entire journey knitting. Oh, she nearly drove me mad with the noise of her needles clicking away. However, her rhythm was not the same as that of the train, and I kept longing for my metronome, which would at least have got her to knit in time with the noise of the wheels. I couldn't work out what she was knitting either. Whatever it was, she had chosen to knit it in the most revolting canary yellow, which, strung on her green needles, was a less than happy blend of colours. Later in the day, on my way back to my compartment, after, spending a penny, or rather 10 centimes, I had to pass a small group of German soldiers at the entrance to my carriage. And as I squeezed past them, one of the officers became rather saucy. He spoke a little French, and asked if he could see me back to my compartment and join me there for the rest of the journey to Paris. I told him, like all his race, he was very chivalrous, but unfortunately all the seats in my compartment were occupied. The German did not seem very pleased. He clicked his heels angrily and gave me a very rude wink as he left. For the rest of the journey he continually walked past the door looking in at me. Maybe he would not have been difficult, but I didn't want to find out. The train arrived at Paris in the evening. The platform was crowded with civilians and German soldiers in grey-green uniforms, and as we funneled towards the exit, we were again made to line up in queues while our papers and luggage were searched. My suitcase was examined by a French gendarme. He opened it and rummaged through the few things inside. Then he closed it again, and was about to give it back, when he noticed a small brass plate next to the lock, with the initials TK. Nobody had thought of this when I had been given my travelling kit. "May I see your papers once more, mademoiselle?" the policeman asked. I was terrified as I handed them over. He pointed to the initials on the case, and the name on the documents, and I said as laughingly as I could, "Oh, TK, Toulouse Guérinards," who I luckily remembered was a very clever writer in the early years, and I just hoped and prayed that nobody on the platform had read any of his work. I thought I detected a wry smile at the corner of the policeman's mouth, but he handed back my papers, and I moved off towards the gate of the station and the street outside. It was a very different Paris from the one I had visited previously on my way to and from Schloss Auerbruck. Shutters covered many of the windows, blinds were drawn, and many of the gay striped awnings had been pushed back. There were still the odd signs of flowers on the window-sills, but the spirit of the people had changed. They seemed subdued and listless. The whistling and singing that I remembered so vividly had disappeared. There was still the unmistakable feel of Paris, though. I left the station and walked across the road to a little kiosk that was still open. I bought an evening paper and asked the man behind the counter to direct me to the address I had been given in Montmartre. The woman, Madame Duvalier, who opened the door in answer to my knocking, was dressed from head to toe in purple. She was wearing a dark green apron, very similar in colour to my Tosca dress, and a bunch of keys. Her hair was nearly scarlet, and her nails were painted black. After I had identified myself, Madame Duvalier led me up a winding staircase to a poky little room at the top of the house. I was so tired by this stage that all I wanted to do was simply fall into bed. I think she realised this, because she drew the curtains across the bare metal rod over the window and told me that she would see me in the morning. She then went out of the room and to my annoyance locked the door. Then I heard her puffing and wheezing as she made her way down the stairs once more. In the morning, Madame Duvalier brought me coffee, a boiled egg, and half a baguette. My egg was surprisingly good. The yolk had not solidified, and I assumed that she had timed her cooking very well. It was only afterwards that I found out she'd kept the egg warm inside the coffee pot, only stopping outside my door to retrieve it with a spoon and put it in the egg cup before knocking. I thought she was terribly inventive. She did not seem in any hurry to move when we'd finished breakfast, so I thought I'd better wash while she was in the room. I'd never been in this position before. I'd never washed in front of anybody, well, except Mother when I was at home. There was nothing to be done about it, however, so I took off the jacket of my Winceyette pyjamas that I'd found under the pillow and washed myself in the icy cold water from the jug. Madame de Valier became alarmed when I threw open the window after my wash. I think she thought I was going to call to someone outside, but I put my towel on myself and I explained to her that as a singer I had to do my deep breathing exercises. She seemed relieved. After I was dressed, her attitude changed. She became very serious once more and gave me instructions for the next part of my journey. You will enter the Boulevard Rochouet. You will walk along the left-hand side. You will find a cafe which will be identified by a bicycle carrying the name of the restaurant Lafayette. There are 2 pots of geraniums on the window ledge to the left of the door. On the other side is a window box with a polyanthus. Her description made me think immediately of the towers. I visualized the polyanthus on the rockery at Bracket Basin, with the beautiful blue, pink, and orange fuchsia. Oh, lovely flowers with their deep yellow golden centres, and their long, soft green leaves like primroses. I found the restaurant with little difficulty. There was only 1 geranium in a pot, but 3 polyanthus in the right-hand window box. But where was the bicycle? I assumed that she'd made a mistake and went inside to a table in one corner. Madame de Valier had told me to look out for a waiter with dark hair parted in the centre, who would be wearing a white apron and a butcher's striped shirt, with no collar, just one of those old-fashioned ivory collar studs. His unmistakable feature would be a distinctive walrus moustache. A waiter who, well, might have fitted that description had he not been wearing a collar and been clean-shaven, came forward to take my order. I had practised my password over and over again. Bon marché! Bon marché! Bon marché! It was easy to remember, because I said to myself, Swan and Edgar's, Griffin and Spaulding's, bon marché. Would you like something, mademoiselle? Asked the waiter. Bon marché! I answered confidently. By all means, mademoiselle, we have many things that are inexpensive on the menu, but would you like to order one? Bon marché! Bon marché! I repeated more insistently, and he smiled wanly and went away. I beckoned over another waiter, and this time ordered a black coffee and a couple of biscuits. Merci, I said when he had brought them. Bon marché, monsieur. Yes, mademoiselle, they are quite cheap, he said, looking rather bemused. No, I whispered, me! I am bon marché, adding a coy wink when he looked at me in amazement. He made a funny snorting sound in his nose, and stalked back to the bar to speak to the owner who was standing behind it. He called over the first waiter I had spoken to, and the 3 of them had a tete-a-tete. The owner came round from behind the bar and approached my table. I smiled at the owner and said confidently, Bon marché, monsieur. This made him look even angrier, and he leant over so that none of the other customers could overhear, and said, I must ask you to leave, mademoiselle. You are upsetting my waiters, and I don't want my respectable customers offended by the likes of you, so please leave before I call the police. When I was absolutely nonplussed, I thought there might have been a minimum charge, so I tried to order an ice cream to show willing, but this did not seem to make any difference. I had to pay my bill there and then I was shown to the door and told never to come back. As I stepped onto the pavement, I looked across the street, and there, on the opposite side, was a bicycle leaning against the wall of a cafe, with 2 geranium pots on the left-hand windowsill and a polyanthus on the other side of a doorway. I must have approached from the wrong end of the road. I was so excited at discovering my mistake, I just rushed into the cafe on the other side of the road. It was dark inside after the bright sunlight of the streets, but I noticed a man standing by the bar, looking just as Madame de Valier had described him to me. Collar stud, parted hair, walrus moustache, and all. "Bonjour, mademoiselle," he said flatly. "Bonjour," I replied, adding rather sheepishly, "Bon marché." The change in his manner was instantaneous. "Oui, oui, mademoiselle," he said enthusiastically, and bought me a glass and a bottle of wine, and showed me to a table by the door at the rear of the cafe. "Please sit down," he told me gently. "We have another here who has lost his way." Then, having closed the street door, he called softly to someone in the room beyond. A man, in an English khaki uniform with a bandage round his head, stepped out of the shadows. The bandage confused me for a moment, but I recognized the uniform immediately, and I could not believe who I was looking at. It was Gil. Neither of us said a word. He suddenly rushed towards me and put his arms round me, and we stood there together, hugging and weeping, bound in a mood of total disbelief. Never had I been so glad to see anybody in my life. "What's all this?" I asked Gil, smoothing my hand across his bandage. "It's all right, Hilda, old girl," he said jokingly. "I was brought here in the dark last night, and as I was going down the steps to the cellar, I tripped and banged my head on one of the barrels at the bottom. Oh, nothing damaged, though. Nothing to damage, I expect." We both laughed. It helped to relieve the tension. Gil had been left behind after the evacuation of Dunkirk, though, as he was quick to point out, that was not strictly true, as he had actually been on the beaches somewhere to the south of Boulogne during the evacuation itself, after a misunderstanding between his map and a couple of signposts. However, he had been lucky, and the Germans he met refused to believe that he really was a British officer, and assumed he was a Frenchman wearing a stolen uniform, trying to pretend that he was British. He'd walked all the way to Paris unmolested, and had finally been taken in by the resistance after he'd been seen asking a German sentry the way to the British embassy. We talked for hours in the back room, until the waiter explained in the evening that his colleagues in the resistance had stolen the car for us, and had forged all the papers that were required to get us through France and down to the Mediterranean coast. There, he told us, we would have to try and make our own way to Gibraltar by sea or by land through Spain. The car was a pre-war Citroën, long and low with running boards and large headlamps that reminded me of a dragon's winking eyes. Gil had never been quick at learning languages. Well, he had difficulty with English quite often, and French had never been his forte, so we decided it would be best for him to travel as a deaf mute. Now, this presented an additional problem, however, since he would have to act, and this had never been a strong point of his either. He had never shown great acting ability at school, though I'd heard that on the occasions he spoke a few lines in the production of The Night of the Burning Pestle in a house play, he got them so mixed up that they introduced an entirely new dimension into the understanding of the play. Gil's interpretation was argued over for months afterwards. I suggested to him that the best thing he could do was to think about my performance in Much Ado About Nothing, the only time he'd ever seen me act, and in the circumstances we both agreed that this was probably sound advice. We were not far from Poitiers when we came to the first roadblock. We were driving through an area of woodland, enjoying the scenery and the light filtering through the trees, almost forgetting for a moment the danger we were in. Gil was whistling the road to Mandalay, and had just got to the chorus, "Take me back to Mandalay, where the flying fishes play," when the car rounded the bend, and we came face to face with a barrier across the road, and soldiers astride motorcycles, with machine gunners crouched in sidecars beside them. "Come on, Gil," I told him. "Remember everything we've told you. You don't say a word. Not a word." We were waved down, and Gil stopped the car. I had to explain to them that my brother was deaf and dumb, and answered their questions. Fortunately, the soldiers were only checking to see where we were travelling to, where we had come from, and what we were carrying in the boot. When they had looked through my case, they lifted the barrier and waved us on. A couple of hours after that roadblock, as the sun was beginning to set, the steering went awry, and we both got out to find a puncture in the front offside tyre. We had a spare, But when we opened the boot, we discovered there were no tools to remove the wheel or jack up the car. We were completely stuck. The nearest village was 6 miles away, and though there might have been a farm nearer than that, it would have probably been very difficult to find in the dark. Just then 2 motorcycles and a car came sweeping round the bend, and 4 German soldiers unslung their guns, pointing them at us. They must have thought this was an ambush, and it was only when one of them came up to us that I recognised the soldier who'd been so attentive on the train to Paris. Well, I couldn't believe my eyes. He seemed agreeably surprised to see me as well. He asked what was the matter, and within minutes had repaired our puncture with their tools. By the time the spare wheel had been secured there, it was after dark, and the officer told us he would escort us to the next town where they were staying the night. He invited me to ride in his car with him, but I said I'd better stay with my brother, so we drove off in convoy, in quite a predicament. When we arrived with a German escort, the local people immediately assumed that we were German collaborators, but we were given accommodation in a small hotel away from the Germans, where the proprietor agreed to help us when he heard our story. When we left in the morning, the German party had been mysteriously delayed by inexplicable engine trouble in all 3 of their vehicles. Of course, they were very charming boys themselves, even the officer who tried to become so fresh on the train. It was only because they were the occupying power that everyone hated them so. The boys themselves could not possibly have enjoyed fighting in the war. I was all for driving round to Marseille after we'd driven through the Dordogne, and Gil even had the wild notion of going all the way to Monte Carlo to play the tables. But, as time was not on our side, and we were not exactly over-endowed with spare cash, we reluctantly agreed to escape to Gibraltar by trying to find a fishing boat that would take us down the coast and drop us off in Spain secretly. When we arrived in Sète, which was just down the coast from Montpellier, we hid the car behind some rubbish in a back street, and made our way to the waterfront to a cafe which seemed to produce the loudest volume of noise. It had a dirty white awning hanging limply in front, and 2 iron tables on the pavement outside. We went to the bar, and Gil ordered a couple of martinis, and we both suddenly realised the deaf-mute had found the power of speech. I was pleasantly surprised to see how well he was able to get by with his French. He'd concentrated on Latin at school, a subject I'd never enjoyed, but Gil had always been good in Latin in his own way. Latin and vivisection. There were people singing, and a man with his accordion was trying to keep up with their raucous choruses. Suddenly, I found myself hoisted up on a table to loud cheers to find I was the only girl in the room. They shouted for a song, and rather coyly when I look back on it, I sang Frère Jacques. When I finished, the men stamped their feet and shouted for an encore. I looked to Gil, and he whispered up to me, "Sing a piece of opera, Hilda. Sing something grand." I quickly thought of something from the Pearl Fishers, which I sang unaccompanied from the top of that table. There was not a sound in the room while I was singing, and as I looked round the totally unknown faces gazing with pleasure up at me, I could not help feeling sad about all those who had helped us in the past week or so. The Italians, the French, and even the Germans unwittingly. Tears were rolling down my cheeks when I finished, and the silence in the room erupted into wonderful applause. I was lifted down from the table, and the way was cleared through the crush to the bar, where they bought us some garlic bread and soup. The astonishing thing was that nobody there asked where we had come from or where we were going. It seemed enough that I had sung to them, and they were happy not to be more inquisitive. It was difficult knowing how to broach the subject of our escape to this friendly crowd, and we had both made 1 or 2 light-hearted attempts when an old man suddenly came out with a completely unexpected suggestion. "Tomorrow morning I am taking my boat out early. The waters are very good at the moment for English mackerel, and I am going to see what I can find." Then, looking at Gil and me with a penetrating glance, he said, "Would you like to come with me?" The tone of the old fisherman's voice was peculiar, and there was a twinkle in his eye that suggested he might have something up his sleeve. We hoped that he might be taking us illicitly into the Spanish coast, so we accepted quickly. The following morning, we went down with him to his boat, which had a noisy diesel engine and piles of fine nets all over the deck. He had one boy who helped him, but on this morning, the boy had been left behind, so that little attention would be roused by more than the usual number of people on his boat. Gill and I were rather surprised when he steered right away from the coast and appeared to be heading out to sea. We were even more surprised when after 2 hours he still had not made any effort to start catching fish. Gill noticed the ship first and asked the fisherman what she was, but he only said, "Wait and see." As we drew closer, the details of the ship became clearer, and we saw the white ensign fluttering at her stern. Gill glanced at the name on the bows, and suddenly the whole episode became clear. The name painted on the bows was HMS Mackerel. Gill and I were helped on board by a couple of sailors, and were promptly taken below to see the captain. It transpired that the old fisherman who had brought us out had been regularly meeting the ship to help ferry supplies and personnel back for the Resistance. This was one of his rendezvous with the ship, and while we were being questioned about our identities and the journey we had made, guns, ammunition, wireless sets, and explosives were being transferred from the ship to his little boat. The Mackerel was bound for Gibraltar, which suited us ideally, and we were royally entertained in the officers' mess for the voyage there. Gibraltar was such a wonderful break after our days on the run. We went to the Barbary Apes, which reminded me of the Italians in the markets in Vicenza in many ways. They chatted away to each other, never listening to what the other was saying. Then, of course, there was the wonderful sound of English voices in the streets for the first time. I remember when we suddenly came across a group of people in the street, and Gill started to ask them the way to our hotel in his best French. "All right, darling, you can speak English again in public without worrying," I told him, and we all started laughing. Though I have to confess that I found it just as difficult, having spoken French for so long, to speak suddenly nothing but English. I think I said bon marché to a couple of the wrong people, but fortunately Gill was there to prevent any further misunderstanding. We spent 10 days in Gibraltar in all, which, although frustrating at the time, no doubt helped us unwind down after our excitement in France. When we eventually found passage on a ship, we were amazed to find other civilians on board, although we never discovered where they'd come from. The ship was bound for Liverpool, and when the docks and outlines of the city came into sight, I looked across at the Liver building and thought, how wonderful this is. I took Gill's hand and said, "Oh, let's go to a show tonight. Let's go and see what's on at the Empire." Of course, we had no idea what we were going to find, having been out of the country for so long, but we were just overjoyed to be home.
And in the evening, by the firelight's glow,
And in the
you'll hold me
evening,
close and never let me go.
close and never
Your
let
eyes will tell me all
I want to know you are home.
when you are home.
Home once more. We'll gather lilacs in the spring.
We'll gather lilacs in the spring.